Science Uncut, presented by the Volkswagen Foundation.
The term dual use is a technical one, but it is not as special a category as one might think, because everything has dual use, says Michael Specter. He's a journalist and used to work for the Washington Post and the New York Times. Now he writes for the New Yorker about science, technology, genetics, and public health. A hammer is a good tool for building a house, but it can also be used for smashing someone's head. Planes are amazing inventions for transporting people and things. They can also be used as weapons, as happened on September 11th, 2001. Michael Specter argues that no one in their right mind would want to stop making planes just because they can be misused as weapons. All we do and should do is try to make them safer. Research on viruses is no different. Yes, Specter admits, a virus is probably the biggest threat to mankind. But we do not know where it might come from. It could be a virus invented in a lab or one that spreads from a chimp. It is the job of science to do as much research as possible on viruses so that we can understand how they work and find vaccines or other ways to contain them. For scientists, just doing their research in the lab isn't enough, Specter argues. In his opinion, scientists need to explain to the wider public what exactly it is they are doing and what good it can do. Michael Specter gave his talk the title, Finding the Balance Between Fear and Progress. He held this talk in Hanover on December 12, 2014, at the Herrenhausen Symposium, Dual-Use Research on Microbes, Biosafety, Biosecurity, Responsibility. The symposium was organized by the Volkswagen Foundation.
Before I say anything else, please try to remember this by the end of the talk. I'm tremendously honored to be here, and I think it's an exceptional meeting and an exceptional group of people. And you're grappling with a problem that I don't really see very many people addressing, and that needs to be addressed. I'm not sure how we will resolve that, but you can't resolve any terrible problem without at least discussing it. And that's what you guys are doing in an extremely sophisticated way. And so that's exciting to me. I've been thinking about dual-use technology for many years, though I didn't know that it was called dual-use technology for the first 93% of that time. And I'm going to be simplistic. I'm not a scientist. Everything is dual use. I mean, hammers build houses. They're also excellent vehicles for crushing people's heads in. So the question of how you can use a piece of technology and can it be used for harm is almost, to me, just as someone looking upon what everyone else here is doing, is almost beside the point. And I'll make a slightly stronger case. A couple years ago, I'm one of those lunatics who happens to think that genetically modified foods will not poison the world, destroy the earth, and end humanity. As a result, I'm unpopular in some groups, and because I'm a radical. I was debating a very nice and intelligent woman who I continued to like very much in India a couple years ago, and she was talking about the evils of American technology. She was talking to this after having called me on her European cell phone, her French cell phone, her US cell phone, but whatever. And as an example of the evils of American technology, she talked about GPS, terrible, terrible GPS. And I thought, well, I sometimes do get lost when I follow the directions. But that isn't what she meant. We were talking about agriculture, and GPS has the ability to very specifically lay down seeds, put inputs into those seeds so that you use immensely reduced amounts of fertilizer and the type of poisons that all the environmentalists hate the GMO people for actually wanting to use. And she said, I said, what's so bad about GPS? And she said, if it wasn't for GPS, the laser-guided missiles that destroyed so many of the buildings in Iraq, which had recently been devastatingly bombed by the US, would not have been able to hit their targets. So that's GPS's fault. That's like saying that we should hate the Wright brothers because of what happened on September 11th. I mean, you know, technologies can be misused. They are going to be misused. They have been misused. I'm still all for having airplanes. And I'm all for having airplanes even though they cause tremendous environmental damage. We need to ameliorate the damage. We need to deal with the problems. But saying, gee, something that is invented once caused harm, let's get rid of it from the planet Earth, is not a grown-up solution to any problem. And unfortunately, this happens a lot. About 10 years ago, I wrote a story for my magazine about a guy maybe some of you have encountered, named Thierry Hedman, who's a virologist in Paris. And he was resurrecting ancient endogenous retroviruses, retroviruses that once meant something, once killed things, but had been broken up by evolution in such a way that we can measure the shards, the molecular existence of those retroviruses are carried around in all our DNA, every one of us. But they're not dangerous. They're not meaningful. He was putting one back together from parts, like it was a home train set. And he was doing that. He made the mistake of calling it the Phoenix virus. It wasn't a mistake for me because my maybe sometimes not so sophisticated editors were so excited by the idea that there was a Phoenix virus that was going to take over the universe that they were like, I was on the next plane to Paris. That isn't what was happening. What was happening and what has at the same time was happening at Rockefeller University, was happening in Israel, was happening in Seattle, was happening at Oxford, and I'm sure many other places. Groups of people were trying to put together retroviruses that no longer existed in real life. And they were doing that in an attempt to figure out how they work. Because we're way into the AIDS epidemic right now, and we've done some remarkable things, but we don't have a vaccine. And the first thing people do when they get a new iPhone is they take it apart. They reverse engineer it. They figure out how you do it, how you put it together, how it works, how it doesn't work, what parts can be dispensed with, what parts could you run the phone without. It's the same principle. I mean, I know you're all thinking this is a simplistic fellow, but it's actually the same principle. You can't understand something if you don't know the constituent elements. And we've had tremendous problems making an AIDS virus. And an AIDS vaccine, I've had many people scream at me, it's because the Western press doesn't care and the medical establishment doesn't care. And I doubt there's any single thing that the medical establishment of the world has invested more energy, more brain power, and more time in the last 30 years than trying to develop an AIDS vaccine. So there's one thing I can say with some certainty. It's not because you guys aren't trying. But it seemed like another good way to look at this problem. At the same time, I wrote a book, when I was writing this thing about endogenous retroviruses, I ran into someone that was mentioned in this conference a couple days ago, so I assume some or maybe many of you know who Eckhard Wimmer was. I'm sorry, he's still alive, so therefore he is. Wimmer put together a polio virus from constituent parts that he bought on the internet. And he did this in 2001 at a time when the US was under attack, when there was anthrax, when the US Congress was even more lunatic and right-wing than it is now. It's almost impossible to say those words, but it was true. And he got pilloried for it. And he didn't just get pilloried by political people. He got pilloried by scientific people. And I wrote this article and I quoted a very famous virologist saying, there are reasons to try and put together viruses so that we can figure out vaccines, but if you look at what Eckhard Wimmer did, this is just proof of principle for bioterrorism. This is outrageous, this is wrong. being basically a monkey, I just wrote that down and put it in my magazine. So about 2 weeks later, I get a call from him. People don't usually call me when they're mad. They just, either they unleash a fusillade of hate mail, or they give up, or they try to get me fired in whatever ways they think is best. Very rarely does anyone ever call me to take issue with something I wrote, which is funny. It's probably the most effective thing to do. Though don't do it. And he said, listen, I read your piece. He's a very elegant man, refined, soft-spoken. He said, your piece couldn't possibly have been more wrong. I said, I hear that a lot. He said, well, I think you should come out to my lab and you should see what I'm doing. And you can spend a day here, and if you still feel that what I'm doing is dangerous, then fine, let's leave it at that. I was writing a book called Denialism at the time, and so I figured I'd go out there, what the hell. So I went out, and he is a truly gentle and genuine man, and he took me through the process. And you can call what he did proof of principle for bioterrorism. It is that. It also let the world know that you can put a polio virus together that works and kills animals, and you can do it on the internet. My kid could do it. My kid's not even good at science. I mean, this is not difficult to do. Now, it was difficult to do when Eckhart did it. But it's getting easier by the minute because computer processing and all these bits are getting cheaper and more accessible, and that is not going to end. And that's a good thing in general, but good things have bad side effects. So I talked to him, and he now is a member of the National Academy of Sciences. He's been awarded commendations from the Congress that hated him. And I was able to write in my book something that I don't usually get to do, which is to say how wrong I was and how right he was. Because you can quibble with that kind of research. You can even think it's the wrong thing to do. But nobody who's ever met him or spent 5 minutes with him could think he's an irresponsible creep who is just trying to make a virus to show that he could. And we see lots of people doing that now. This is the age of synthetic biology. People are building things all the time. There's a guy, some of you may know, out in California named Drew Endy. He's a good biologist and an excellent speaker about biology. And I said, how do you feel about the fact that you're making forms of life? He said, well, we are able pretty soon to be able to end all human life as we know it. Now, that is not on the good side of dual use. I mean, these things are very heavy, and they're very real, and they're very significant. But if we could make gasoline that we could put in our cars that would power our world without having to dig it up and burn the world to the ground, and we could do that at a decent price, or if we could make meat in a factory that was not meat, but grown from culture, that was protein that could be fed to people who don't get protein, but instead often eat things like chimpanzees that carry the viruses that we then spread around the world, and we could do that for good costs. Nobody does risks and benefits. People say there's a risk of something bad happening. If Eckhard Wimmer puts a polio vaccine together, there's a risk it could get out, someone could understand it, people would get polio, it would be a disaster. That's a risk. What are the benefits? The benefits are maybe we can have a cheap, more available vaccine in a world that still has polio. Maybe we can figure out a way. We have smallpox problems, and they're not going away. It would be nice if we could, like that, put a smallpox vaccine together out of DNA bits. I'm pretty sure we have the knowledge, the sophistication to do that. How do we make vaccines? How do we make flu vaccines? We have, for the last since 1947, grown them in eggs in Pennsylvania. I was recently chastised because apparently we've now graduated to egg broth. But think of it. I can download on my phone any song that any one of you could possibly ask me to download, and I could do it here now and we could be listening to it in a minute. It seems trivial, but it's not. It's amazing. I can do that. I can transfer money to an account in Indonesia, as I so often do. But we can't grow a vaccine except in a chicken egg and hope that the weather's right? I mean, that's just crazy. That's just not right. And it's also beneath us because we can, in fact, do much, much better. So I find these dual-use debates to be difficult and almost not, I won't say not worth it. I don't think you guys are wasting your time. But I sometimes think scientists are a little naive. And nobody's ever said that about journalists, by the way, so I'm safe here. You guys can create the greatest situation in the world. You can all agree on something that will work. You can all agree on a system. It seems to me from what I've heard the last couple of days, people seem to agree, well, we probably can't prevent information from getting out when the information is already there, when you're doing the work. But we could stop the work. We could prevent the work from happening. And my only response to that is, you must be joking. I mean, really, that's not going to happen. That's not an answer to your problem. You're not going to prevent research. There's some smart kid somewhere, a bad guy, a smart guy. You know, someone told me his biggest fear about this kind of thing was a smart kid at Harvard who was bored and had a computer. And he was playing around with digits, and he was playing around with chemicals. It doesn't have to be an evil person. There was a book written this year called I Am Pilgrim. It's a thriller. I don't usually read them, but someone recommended it, and it was about an Al-Qaeda operative who went to medical school, spent years as a postdoc, bid his time, figured out how to assemble a smallpox vaccine, smallpox itself, got the machines on the internet that you can use. He was in Germany. This is fiction. Germany doesn't matter. I want to make that clear. He inserted this smallpox into flu vaccines that were made here that were going to be shipped to the East Coast of America. And some smart CIA guy found out and figured it out at the last minute. I mean, it's a novel. It's a thriller. It's not completely ridiculous either. I mean, these things can happen. Bad things can happen. And I guess you have to ask yourselves, are we gearing up? Is the point of this kind of group or science itself to prevent bad things from happening or make good things happen? I'm going to go with the make good things happen. When Ron had his problem, I flew off to the Netherlands instantly to see him, something that to this day I think he regrets. But it seemed like an amazing thing to me that, this isn't a lunatic guy. This is a famous virologist who was funded by the National Institutes of Health to do exactly what he was doing. And I was in Thailand when H5N1 became really scary for the first time. And all the CDC guys there said the same thing. We need to get this to a lab and we need to take it apart so we can figure out what genes go where so we can play with them. And so that we can figure out, maybe you knock a gene out and that's the end of it. Maybe you can make a vaccine out of what we know. I think that was Ron's purpose. I think that is the purpose of most of this stuff. How can you stop that research? What is the point of preventing that research? What do you think you're going to get out of it? And I asked this question the other day from up there, but I'm quite serious about it. I wonder how many of you think, Joshua Lederberg said this famous thing, that the thing that threatens the dominance of mankind more than any other thing is a virus. I think that's true. And I wonder how many of you think that virus is going to be made by some evil guy in a lab or, by a monkey or a chimp that someone ate for food in Cameroon and that has evolved for 10,000 years or 100,000 years and maybe killed a bunch of people and died out. I mean, we have no ability to make rational judgments. And if you don't believe me, then go look at the way the United States covered Ebola in the United States, because it was sickening. And I say this as someone who understands what Ebola is, understands the threat it poses to the places where it's dangerous, and what it says about the healthcare system and the system of community interaction. We had 2 people die of Ebola. In America, 200 people a weekend die of texting while driving. Really, I'm not making that figure up. You don't see people. Chuck Schumer, the Democrat, increasingly right-wing Democratic senator from New York, said, what we need to do is we need to take the temperature of everyone who comes into this country and we need to board vessels in the sea and see if those people have temperatures. So I did a little work. Some people did that. I was in Hong Kong during SARS. Between Hong Kong, Canada, and Singapore, they took the temperature of 47 million people entering their countries during the SARS epidemic. 47 million. 4 of those people went to hospital, and none of them had SARS. That's a really bad statistical average. Because people were saying, including my editor, what's so wrong? You're to be on the safe side. Like, 0 out of 37 million, that's what they got in Hong Kong. That's not being on the safe side. That's wasting resources, making people be afraid of the wrong thing. And there are incubation times, and we all know this. It doesn't matter. There are other ways to deal with this. And this is known and has been discussed. We don't respond to the threats that are real as acutely as we respond to the threats that are sitting right in our face. And so I can't tell you how many people, including members of my family, who I've now excommunicated, who called me and said, we shouldn't travel to Morocco, or one was going to southern Italy during this Ebola crisis, right? Meanwhile, Peter Piot, one of the people who discovered Ebola and who then spent many years running UNAIDS and is somebody I know well and think highly of, said many times, without taking anything away from this problem, I'd sit next to someone on the subway who had Ebola. As long as he doesn't vomit on me, I'm good to go. And that's true. We know that's true. We know there is reason to be afraid of that virus, but we also know that it's not what it was said to be. And so one of our problems, and of course I totally exempt myself, is the media. Because we like to hype stories, and there's nothing more hypeable than, viruses that kill people, viruses that come into the country undetected, viruses that spread in ways we don't understand. And that's the world we live in. Those things are going to happen. They have happened, and they're going to happen. And I want to stress that I don't think these things are the faults of scientists. I think it's great for scientists to sit around and have a similar event like this and others that I know many of you are attending, where you try to figure out what's the right thing to do, because you're probably more likely to figure it out than any of the other groups of people who are going to try. But I think you have to remember, don't take this the wrong way, but you will. You don't matter as much as you think you do. Because the people who matter are the politicians. The people who matter are the guys who can say, let's take 37 million temperatures. Let's lock up a woman who's a nurse who was in Liberia who tested negative for Ebola, but we're going to lock her up anyway, because we could be wrong. She could have Ebola. These are the people we need to communicate with, and this unfortunately brings me to the crux of the dual use problem. To me, the dual use problem is that there's information and there's misinformation. It isn't a question of can you use something for good or bad. It's how do you understand these things? Do you try? And, you know, in Europe and increasingly in our country, we don't care. The vaccine rate in the fancy parts of Los Angeles is now the same as the vaccine rate in Sudan. I'm not even making that up. I mean, Jesus Christ, that is one of the most shameful things a person can say in the modern world, but it's true. And I've debated with these people. These are not poorly educated people. I can't tell you how many people who went to Yale or Harvard who told me they're not vaccinating their kids. And they don't do it for a simple reason, because they don't know about these diseases. Nobody's seen measles. Polio, they can't. One woman wrote me and said, I'm not going to vaccinate my kid against polio. We don't have it in the US. That's great unless somebody is on a plane from Afghanistan or Chad or Nigeria who has it, and they infect someone, because I believe that's how viruses work. They don't get announced in advance. You can't open the New York Times and say, polio coming here today, watch out. And yet, this is who we are, and it's not just who we are. Europe has these problems. I mean, America's a special case. You have to remember, I live in a country where 50% of the people think that angels are real. And that is a problem. And that is a problem that sort of defines all other problems. But I do feel that education is the weapon we need. And I will just tell you this, because it's a pet thing of mine. The anti-GMO sentiment in America is growing rapidly and virulently and ludicrously. And a week ago, there's an organization called IQ Squared that was founded in England, but it also works in America. And they put on debates. They put on, next week, they're having a debate about Amazon, good or bad. You know, I mean, they're big, giant things that you can't answer. So this one was a proposition: are GMOs good or are they bad? And the people arguing for GMOs, one of whom was a scientist from UC Davis, the other one was Rob Fraley. He's the guy who basically invented this stuff at Monsanto. He is the embodiment of evil to these people. I like Rob. But I mean, he is what they hate more than anything else in the world. And they debated a woman who had spent a long time at the Union of Concerned Scientists and an expert named Chuck Benbrook on pesticides. And the way that the debate works is a bunch of sort of lefty Upper West Side New Yorkers go into a big giant auditorium, and before the debate begins, you vote. And so the vote before the debate began was about 28% for GMO, 32 or 3% against, and 40% undecided. And they had this debate. I've seen how this turns out. This is a movie you know the ending of. But when they when they voted at the end of the debate, the final tally was 61% for GMO, 28% against, and then whatever, you guys do the math. The rest undecided. I'm not paid for math. And this to me was shocking. They did it online too, and 30,000 people participated. And that was much closer because you get a different kind of group online. But that was still pro-GMO. I cannot begin to tell you how shocking that was. But what it said to me, I teach a course at Bard College on how to feed the world. And the first day of those courses, I say to all the kids, how many of you would avoid eating GMOs if you could? Everyone raises their hand, everyone. So then I talked to them for 10 minutes about golden rice, vitamin A rice, infused with vitamin A, what it could do. Also making the point, which is often not made, that these things aren't going to solve the world's problems. They're a tool. We need the tools, but they're a tool. After 10 minutes, I say, how many of you think golden rice sounds like it might be useful? And they all say, yeah, that sounds great. So at that point I say, okay, now you're all pro-GMO. In the next 13 weeks, we can just work out the details. But I think that's a little bit of what we need here. We can't talk about dual use technology. We can't talk about, these are abstract intellectual ideas to most of the people who aren't in the room. You need to talk about what good is this stuff. And that should be easy to do because it's the greatest time in the history of science. And the things that people are developing are wonderful and are going to help us live longer and better and have more opportunity. And you don't hear that. You just hear the scare stuff. So that, I'm going to stop my prattling on because I think I've done too much of that. But I would just urge you guys, one last thing. Scientists often feel like, I'm a scientist, I work hard, that's my job, that's all I need to do. I'm sorry, you're wrong. You need to tell people what you do. Not every person in every lab. But if you guys are in a lab and there's not one person in that lab who can explain what it is you're doing, even if it's just basic research, just seeking answers to fundamental questions, which is very important, if somebody can't explain that to a human being, you're not going to get funding, and I don't even think you should. So that's my happy way of ending this. Thank you.